Hi, I'm Julia Fulgham, the Director of Advance at UNM, and thank you for joining us on this remote snow day. And today we're delighted to have the next edition of our Women Influencing Policy series with Melanie Moses and Sonia Gipson Rankin. Melanie is a professor in computer science and a PI on the Advance grant, and is graciously sharing some time on her sabbatical to do this with us. So we appreciate this. And Sonia is an assistant professor in the law school, and many of us know her from her time as associate dean in University College, when she was the mastermind and energy between a number of freshman success programs. I could easily spend the next hour going through their awards and accomplishments for UNM, for the community, and for their professions, but I'd rather hear them talk about what they're doing. So today they've joined us to talk about work they and other colleagues are doing on algorithmic justice. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Melanie and Sonia.
All right. Well, thank you, Julia. It's fabulous to be here. I was really happy. I've been saying no to lots of things, a trick I learned from working with Advance while I'm away on sabbatical, but I could not pass up the opportunity to present with Sonia because I learned so much and it's so much fun just to work together. So I'm really happy that we're going to be able to introduce the Algorithmic Justice Project that we're both part of. And this is fairly informal. We have slides, which we shamelessly cribbed from some of our colleagues. And we also, though, want to leave some time for discussion and invite folks to kind of jump in with questions as we go along. So I will start on the next slide with our group. So this is a group that has a terrible acronym, but is called the Interdisciplinary Working Group on Algorithmic Justice. And it's a group of us that came together because we decided we had something to say to each other, and maybe we would have something important to say to the state of New Mexico and maybe the world more broadly. So we proclaimed ourselves a group. No one told us that we should be a group except ourselves. We did not ask permission. We just forged forward and decided that we would work together. Sorry, I'm getting a bunch of Slack notices. Got to turn that off. That we would just start some conversations about what algorithmic justice is, what it means to us in the state of New Mexico, what it means to us from our different disciplines. And it's been just absolutely fabulous, the conversations that we've had over email and in person and with other folks. So I'll just quickly mention a few of the people here on this picture. Oops, sorry. So that some I think might be, you can go, thanks, Sonia. Sonia's doing the slides, thanks. So Chris Moore is actually a former computer science professor at UNM. He's now at the Santa Fe Institute. He is a computer science theory researcher and really had become concerned about the use of algorithms and recognized that in the computer science community, we are really lacking the perspective about justice that we need. If we want to use algorithms for justice, we need the perspective of people from political science and law and social science to really make this work. So this has been a great partnership. I think folks have heard from Kathy on this series before from political science. She just brings a really fantastic analytical mind from a different kind of social science perspective than those of us in computer science have. We'll mention some things that Alfred and Sonia have done from the law school. And I'll just mention that both of them, Sonia has a computer science undergraduate degree. Alfred has a mathematics background. So it's really made it possible to have this kind of conversation because, well, at least they know parts of our language. I have to say I knew nothing about the law, but I've learned a tremendous amount from their brilliant analysis, and we'll talk about that through the talk. Okay, so that's our group and the disciplines we come from. And so the next slide has what we decided we're about. So we really work to identify the mathematical, computational, political, and legal implications of algorithms. And we started with a focus on algorithms and more, in part due some of the work that Alfred and Kathy were doing, realized that we can't talk about algorithms without talking about data, the data that feed into algorithms. And so we want to understand the implications that are really determining the fate of people in the criminal justice system, specifically in New Mexico, the New Mexico context. But we've broadened that to look at other public sectors as well. And our focus has been on trying to communicate to the public and to policymakers and stakeholders the importance of algorithms that are certainly correct, that are transparent so people understand what they're doing, that are or have a chance to understand what they're doing. Transparency is insufficient for that. That are explainable so that people on all sides of people whose lives are affected by algorithms, policymakers who are deciding how to use them, actually understand how they work, because it is often incredibly opaque. And then they're accountable. So we'll talk through what that means with some specific examples. And this is a little bit more about who we are. We are really trying to emphasize our role as independent scientists and legal scholars, so that, for example, if there is someone in the legal system, a judge, a policymaker who's considering using an algorithm, for example, to make, we'll talk a bit about this, to make decisions about when someone should be released pre-trial back into the community and when someone should be kept, is recommended to be kept in jail before a trial. Algorithms are being used more and more, particularly in New Mexico in that context. And there are many costs and many sort of dangers and many benefits of that kind of approach. And we want to be really a resource for policymakers who might not understand how algorithms work, to help explain what might be going on under the hood. And so in addition to just being a resource for policymakers, we're really trying to demystify algorithms and help people make sense of them, explain these strengths and weaknesses in different contexts, to offer policy advice when possible. And a lot of what we've realized is that means we have to learn a lot. I've changed my attitude about how the costs and benefits of algorithms in the justice system quite a bit from talking to a wide variety of people. Okay. So that's just a little bit of an intro. I think now Sonia is going to take over and give you some specifics about what we've been doing.
Great. No, thank you. And as always, as Melanie said, I say yes. If they say Melanie's involved, I say yes. I have yet to find something I don't enjoy working with her on. So this is an honor to be able to chat with the larger UNM and faculty community on this. And here's just a picture of what we've done. So in terms of being a group that just named ourselves this group, we put up a website and we began to just basically hang our shingle and say, here we are, here are the things we think about. And we've had an opportunity to get engaged in the diversity of ways that algorithms have an impact on individuals' lives in more than one context. So for instance, last November, some of you may have studied and seen that HUD, the Housing and Urban Development wing of the federal government, was looking for public comment on a new implementation they wanted to add to the Fair Housing Act. And they had changed the language where it was going to be adding a focus and allow for basically defendants, which would particularly be housing units, would be able to say that the reason they discriminated against, or be able to offer as a defense that an algorithm made me do it. Kind of some new language, right? The devil made me do it. The algorithm made me do it. I didn't know I was going to be discriminating. And so they asked for public comment, and our group, the Interdisciplinary Working Group for Algorithmic Justice, put forward a really unique mix of law and computer science and public policy argument to present to HUD and add to the public comments. It was picked up by Forbes magazine, or Forbes.com, which actually did a write-up on us right here in New Mexico, talking about our group. And you'll see a quote from the article out of Forbes talking about our HUD public comment. Now, this became very interesting because it has bubbled and turned into a lot of other work. So for instance, a subgroup of us are still working on this HUD implementation. HUD listened to us very carefully and removed the word algorithm altogether. And so a subgroup of us, Alfred Matthewson, Chris Moore, myself, and as need be, others will start to work with a group called Lawyers for Civil Rights out of Boston, Massachusetts. This is a racial justice impact litigation nonprofit that is working to address this. And we are already in the process and actually meeting this afternoon to talk about completing an amicus brief as we work with the Lawyers for Civil Rights. We've also been contacted and have worked with different parts of the United States federal wing. And so on the right-hand side, if you look super closely at the very bottom, you'll see that that's a picture of myself and Melanie and a small group of others, a woman named Katie from the ACLU New Mexico, speaking with U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich on the impact of algorithms and what they mean and what is bias within algorithms. So a subgroup of us are also going to be working with some people from the U.S. House Financial Services Committee about these different marks. And another group of our colleagues, Chris Moore and Kathy Powers, just presented before the New Mexico Criminal Justice Reform Subcommittee about the impact of algorithms and looking very carefully at these things. So this is what we are excited to do, which is to take our scholarship and our different areas of research and turn them into actually public policy and national impact and local impact. So for instance, I've been able to take a lot of this work, and I actually have an article that will be coming out next April out of the Washington and Lee Law Review, focusing on criminal justice and the impact of hacked data if it's used in the criminal justice system. So where does this shake itself out? We show you all of these things, and we talk about this to show that this is bigger than just criminal justice, which is where you may hear about it in the news. Some of you may have seen recently about the gentleman who was arrested and basically badgered until they were attempting to get him to admit that he was an individual who had committed a crime. This is in, I believe, Detroit, but it turns out it wasn't him at all. The camera picked up and identified the wrong person. So that becomes very visible, but it actually shows us that algorithms and justice, these high stake decisions are being used all across the board in housing and lending, in finance, in social services, in education on how they're rating teachers, on the college admissions, and in criminal justice as another area. So I'm going to turn it back over to Melanie, who's going to explain what are algorithms. And if you've got questions, please start throwing them in the chat so we can have those so you don't have to lose your thought. But Melanie?
Great. Okay. So yeah, we've been talking about algorithms, and we know that sometimes people don't know exactly what algorithms are. It's a word that's probably meant to make something sound often fancier than it is, right? So algorithms are simple. Algorithms are essentially recipes, right? It's a set of instructions. It might be to solve a problem or complete an action or to make a prediction, but it's just a set of instructions like a recipe. So this is a little example, right? You can go to allrecipes.com and you can get a recipe for anything now. The internet is full of recipes. And it's going to have a list of ingredients, which are just the inputs, a set of instructions, step by step, what to do. And then you get some output, one hopes, this one bowl chocolate cake that looks delicious. The recipe analogy sort of points, though, to some of the problems we have with algorithms. So one such problem is, appears on the next slide, which is that context really matters. So for those of us who've tried to bake a cake at 5,000 feet, right, you follow the normal directions, it often doesn't work right. Right, it does. There's no warning that says this algorithm does not work at 5,000 feet. Well, sometimes there's a warning, but when you first move there, you don't realize it. So this is what happens when you bake at high altitude with a sea level recipe. So that's one of the problems that we have with algorithms, is that they assume some certain context, right? They assume that water boils at a particular temperature. They assume that things will rise at a certain rate. They also make assumptions about the inputs, right? So they assume that it actually says on there for some reason, 2 large eggs. But what's a large egg, right? We have some sort of societal understanding about what is a large egg and an agreement at the grocery store. It assumes that those eggs are not spoiled, right? So if you try to make this recipe with a sour cup of milk, then you'll get what you'd see on the next page, which is well known in computer science, garbage in, garbage out. That the algorithm is not magic, right? The algorithm is doing some transformation on input to get to output, but if the input is wrong, then the output is going to be not what you expected. So it's really important to understand that that an algorithm is a really simple thing. It's just a set of instructions written in a language that's very precise for a computer to understand. But even with this sort of human example, there are many different kinds of mistakes, and these are just sort of two of the typical ones that you see. With computer algorithms, this is much worse, right? Because we have some shared context and we can sort of cover up for mistakes or ambiguities in the instructions, right? And the computer is not going to do that. And so there's a lot of concern. This is, I think, maybe some of the first concerns that computer scientists started to have, is that, you know, maybe algorithms are not producing what we expect. And we'll see sort of how that plays out as we go through this. Okay, so we have this understanding of this basic understanding of an algorithm. And then there's this broader question, which I think has gotten a good deal of, begun to get some attention. It's a lot of attention. It needs to get a lot more attention. And that is, we can have algorithms. They can be, in some cases, what I just talked about, can be very simple algorithms, things as simple as, you know, this is the instructions for baking a cake, nothing that anyone couldn't understand. But now we have artificial intelligence, which is using algorithms, which are often very opaque and hard to understand. And they're being used in all kinds of different contexts. So at the point where Sonia and I had the conversation with the senator, we wanted to sort of boil down what are the real issues that you need to think about as we're discussing developing new algorithms in the field of artificial intelligence and deploying them in all sorts of ways that impact people in society. So we came up with 3, 4, 5. We thought we'd try to boil this down to things that are simple. So 3 ways that AI perpetuates bias. This is sort of at the heart of, you know, why we need to be concerned about algorithms and AI and the potential for bias in the world. It's wonderful that our senator actually has it on his radar that he should have these discussions. So the first, I think the most sort of nefarious piece of the problem is that what AI tends to do, and algorithms tend to do, is they codify existing biases. So we understand that there are biases in the world, right? The criminal justice system is not fair to Black and brown people. There are all sorts of historical legacies that mean that we're not on an even playing field. There is the potential for algorithms to remove human bias. That potential is there, but there's also the potential for algorithms to take the world as it is and say, okay, now this, actually, we sort of take this as input, we take this as given, and then we run it through the algorithm and we have some output, and we now think we've sort of removed the bias. But what we've done is we've just encoded it and we've made it really easy to replicate. And we've taken something which is this existing bias, which is a negative thing, but it's also sort of squishy and amorphous and not the same everywhere, and made it and sort of cemented it. And so that, to me, is sort of the largest, sort of the biggest fear I have for the direction we're going with for developing algorithms that impact society. There are a number of cases of unintended consequences where the algorithm is supposed to do one thing, but it does something else. There's a great example of Amazon had a hiring algorithm that basically looked at its existing pool of workers and said, what do these people look like? These are the people we want to hire. And what the algorithm did was punish people with the word woman on their CV. It could have been that the word woman was they were on the women's crew team, or just having the word woman on your CV made the algorithm say, it doesn't look like you fit here, right? So that's, and to Amazon's credit, they published this and they said, this is what our algorithm is doing. They were probably doing some bit of that already, right? That it just wasn't made explicit. Nefarious actors, there's an example that Kathy talks about that some banking system was designing an algorithm for giving out loans. It was not going to be explicitly racist. They understood that they couldn't do that, but they included in the algorithm, essentially you got negative points in the algorithm for buying rap music. This is, right, which was a not thinly veiled attempt to deny loans to Black people. What actually happened, though, was unintended consequences, because it turns out a lot of white teenagers listen to rap music, right? And so these things are all sort of tied together. We've been really interested in explaining ways in which algorithms need to be transparent, explainable, accurate, and reliable. And as I said, transparency means essentially you can see the code, you can see what's under the hood. Sonia will talk more about this. Often you have absolutely no ability to see what an algorithm is actually doing. Then the second step is once you see what it's doing, can you explain it? Explainable AI is now a whole research field because neural networks are kinds of algorithms that take data, do a bunch of statistical manipulations, and then make predictions. And that bunch of statistical manipulations, no one knows what they're doing. Those manipulations are designed by the machine, and the designer designed the thing that designed the algorithm, but they didn't actually set the steps that turn input into output. And so explainability is often difficult. In fact, many people in AI are now developing AI systems to explain other AI systems. And then there's the question of, do they do that correctly, right? And do they explain things in a way that actually transfers the relevant information to the relevant people? Then of course, we're concerned that there's inaccuracy and that different contexts can lead to different results.
Melanie, could I jump in before you get to 5? Because I think I just wanted to share with our colleagues that this is where it sounds like big, I like how Melanie said it, right? This idea of an algorithm is the machine coming for us, but it's really something that can be boiled down. And this is one of the moments where you'll see the benefit of an interdisciplinary group working with our senators and congresspersons and corrections facilities. Because when Melanie outlined step 5, or the 5 steps, it is to make it give the people some kind of queries and questions that they should ask to their developers, right? They may not get in and get all hyped about generative adversarial networks, like Melanie and I have been thinking and studying about, right? They're not going to want to know, what kind of what the data sets look like, and they're not going to even understand how the code is writing itself. But they can learn to ask critical questions and ask, did you think about bias in these spaces? Sorry, Melanie, go ahead.
No, that's wonderful. And so we agreed we would just jump in. So I always like it when Sonia jumps in. So. And actually that gives me an excuse for an aside. So one of the conversations that Sonia and I had, this is one of my favorite conversations of the year, maybe ever, in talking about what issues do we want to raise with Senator Heinrich. One of the questions is, algorithms have the opportunity to really change how we interpret law. And in how law is interpreted, as Sonia has explained to me, right, is what the law is. And this series of interpretations, if we're handing that over to algorithms, this is a dramatic sort of giving up of what we consider sort of, the power of a democracy, and handing that over to these automated processes that are designed by particular people with particular assumptions and motivations. So we decided that we need a new constitutional convention for algorithms, right? That we really need to sit down and decide what are the priorities here that we want our algorithms to uphold. You'll read many computer science papers that say the algorithm should uphold human values. Well, what the heck are human values, right? I mean, there's a huge amount of social context that computer scientists don't think deeply enough about, and so it's great to talk to lawyers and political scientists and social
publication forthcoming.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So to make these things a little more concrete, right? So you have an algorithm that's making a decision about should this person be, released from pretrial detention, and an algorithm is going to make a choice. You want to know, how was the data that's feeding into that algorithm collected? Was it collected from a system that is itself biased? So if it was collected from the criminal justice system itself, then we expect that there are already the biases that we know about in the criminal justice system. This next 2 things, how is the algorithm trained and how does it work? Some algorithms are really simple. It's just something like a regression line where it's, if you've been arrested more than 3 times, you are unlikely to show up for your trial. We've seen that in the data. 60% of people who were arrested at least three prior times don't show up for their next trial. And so the algorithm just makes a simple association. But sometimes it's these neural networks that have these very complicated manipulations of the data, and we don't and the algorithm sort of trains itself. Once the algorithm is trained to make a prediction, then it's how does it work? How does it actually take new data and filter, process that new data, transform that into an output? And who has control over those processes? How it's being used is, I think, the piece of this that I've appreciated more and more as we've talked to politicians and lawyers. The system in which the algorithm is embedded really matters. So does the algorithm just make a recommendation to a judge and the judge can ignore the recommendation or go forward with it? Or does the law say, if the algorithm says, if you have a score of this or higher, or that you must make this decision, then maybe the judge's hands are tied. Or maybe it appears that the judge can make a certain decision, but politically the judge would never go against the algorithm. Or maybe they would only never go against it if it made a negative recommendation, but it would go against it for a positive recommendation. And all of those subtle things make a huge difference in terms of, how many people are actually kept in jail because of the recommendation of an algorithm. And then this how is it doing is the need to just continually revalidate. If you're using an algorithm and you think it's got some outcome, you've got to check that repeatedly. Okay. So we can go to the next slide. And this just probably restates some of the things that I said, but we've really been focused on a couple of risk assessment algorithms. There's one called the Arnold system and one called Compass, both of which are used in New Mexico right now. The Arnold system is used in Bernalillo County, and part of the reason it is used quite frequently now is that a few years ago, we all had a vote on whether or not to eliminate bail as the measure by which you, how you get out of jail before a trial. And when we eliminated that, there then had to be a decision. How do we decide who to keep in and who to let out? And so these risk assessment tools have been adopted quite quickly, and sometimes with very well-intentioned people who recognize, in fact, that the system that we have now is keeping many people in prison and that shouldn't be. And so algorithms at least appear to be a tool to sort of mitigate that. Okay, but maybe I'll just quickly sort of say that usually these are based on some kind of statistical patterns in a database of training data, an assumption that whoever the defendant is who is being analyzed is going to have a similar outcome to people who have similar data in the training database. So the decision about what data is in that database and what counts as similar, what axes along, we'll measure. Are we similar in race and gender and age, or do we care about occupation, or what are the ways in which you can be similar to someone else, and therefore their outcome is assumed to be predictive of your outcome. And so algorithms make all kinds of different predictions. Failure to appear is maybe one of the interesting ones. What is the likelihood you're not going to show up for your trial? What's the likelihood that you're going to commit new criminal activity? All right, and the next slide then really kind of focuses on transparency, but I think Sonia is reminding me we're getting probably low on time to get to some of the more interesting questions. So maybe what we'll do is let's get to the next slide. I'm going to skip this one. That when you have an algorithm that's making a prediction about whether a person is going to show up for trial, local revalidation is really important. So we know every population is different. We think New Mexico is more different than other places, although I think almost anywhere can make that case. So there's different demographics, there's different implementation of algorithms. And algorithms based on a national data set, just like baking at high altitude, they may perform differently in New Mexico. So the transparency after you've deployed the algorithm and that revalidation, the reliability of the algorithm in the local context is really important to check. And the validation studies need to be done by honest brokers, right? Not by the company that's selling you the software. So the next slide sort of, I think, gets us to data that shows sort of the essence of the problem. So this is data on the Arnold Foundation, which is actually probably one of the better algorithms that's out there. It's a transparent algorithm. You can download the algorithm. You know what data goes into it. The data seem to make sense. And it makes predictions about things like, will this defendant appear in court if we let them go before their trial? And the blue boxes here are showing failure to appear is on the y-axis, and the Arnold's risk score. So the output of the algorithm, 6 is bad. 6 means you are more likely to not appear. And the blue boxes are the data the research data that this algorithm was trained on. It's a nonprofit, it's very open, it explains how this all works. And it has a certain correlation. The yellow stars and the green circles are Kentucky and New Mexico. And they are very different, right? There is still an increased chance of failure to appear with a higher score, but it's not as high as it is for the national training data set. And in fact, when you look at new criminal activity or new violent criminal activity, it's really different from the national data. And so, essentially what you're doing is you're taking a score, even if the algorithm made sense, was making some reasonable prediction on the data on which it's trained, when you put in a different population with different characteristics, you're no longer sort of making a prediction about risk, you're just assuming a correlation that isn't necessarily going to hold. Okay, so that's some of the problems that we're kind of facing and some of the things that we want our policymakers to understand when they're implementing algorithms.
And so, so this will get into what it looks like, right? And I won't go into it too much, but what Melanie outlined is those final numbers and the part that should concern everyone, right? And I never thought I'd become a tinfoil hat kind of person, but here we are, right? There's a thing that's occurring within the black box that even the code developers are not able to articulate how it got where it was, right? So we get to this idea of not having a sense of if a person is high risk or low risk, but there's no way to independently validate the actual accuracy of the prediction that is made. Because not only, going back to the garbage in, garbage out, which is of course such a perfect way to describe it, we don't even quite know what information is coming in. Many of the questionnaires that are being used for a product like Compass are not completely completed by persons who are required to fill them out. Issues like race can be the difference between whether or not it is something the defendant would have listed about their own race versus what someone's street race is. Dr. Nancy Lopez explains a lot about street race and someone having a different picture of who you are. Tiger Woods told us he was Caucasian, but when he got arrested for DWI in Florida, they wrote black. So when you start to look deeper into these things, what is the actual input of what's brought in, but also the fact that defendants don't have a really explainable way to understand what has occurred to them. And because these are proprietary softwares, Melanie told us that the Arnold tool is actually available for review, but products like Compass and the 50 plus other algorithmic criminal justice risk assessment instruments are proprietary and do not explain how they get to their outcome. So for example, this just happened back in 2017, but this gentleman, Glenn Rodriguez, was denied parole because the Compass score gave him a high risk. And the score was based on this idea of incorrect data that had been entered, an actual garbage in. Even though the prison staff admitted there was a mistake, they never updated his score. And because it was a black box, he was never given an explanation of what happened. He did not have a license to access the Compass product. And he was not even able to tell the parole board what his score would have been if the data was correct. It would take 2 years before the parole board would overturn what the software said to do. So as Melanie outlined about that confirmation bias that can happen by our judges and our decision makers, 2 extra years because the software told them to do something and they refused to look deeper into it. For example, you may also be familiar with proxies and redlining. Redlining is this practice refusing to provide a loan or insurance to someone because of an area that they live in being deemed a poor financial risk. Once again, this is the complexity of the black box. We don't know the weight that is being given to whether or not one buys rap music or not. We don't know the weight being given that shows that my credit card swipes at the Dollar Tree versus swiping at Nordstrom Rack versus the actual Nordstrom, not even the Nordstrom Rack, right? We don't know what it means when it shows what grocery stores I regularly go to. And because many times the people that will be impacted by these black boxes don't have access to resources to show or even to articulate or get access to the products that are being used. The algorithms, it's amazing. We're at an amazing time in technology. I know Melanie and I both agree on this, on what the algorithms can do. We're also at a concerning point in the technology because now the designers aren't even able to predict what the code is going to do and be able to provide some kind of route to understand that. So this is what we submitted when thinking about these issues. Gosh, I can't even believe it was just a year ago, Melanie. It feels like we were just talking about this. And in the olden days when people would gather in person and talk over coffee and tea. But we wrote this and we were able to get it included. It was one of thousands that were submitted. But here at UNM and with the Santa Fe Institute and right here in New Mexico, we have been able to be influential and to provide some understanding about how and the impact shakes out. I'll turn it back to Melanie to talk about what feedback loops do.
So, the way that we typically think about how algorithms work is in this, this mode of there's data out in the world, the algorithm is some black box that transform it and we get an output. But there's another piece of this, which is the output becomes the input for the next run of the algorithm. So the algorithm is not separate from the system. The algorithm is actually part of the system. Where, the feedbacks of who is kept in prison, who is arrested, then becomes the data that determines who is likely to be kept in prison and arrested the next time. And so what I think is a really important question for us to start to ask is, will this year's predictions, when it affects next year's data, will this decrease bias over time or will it amplify it? And my fear is the way that we're thinking about algorithms now is that we're amplifying and solidifying and codifying the bias that already exists. And so, I mean, this is a very clear case of if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? And the algorithms at this point, I think, are part of sort of the bias problem. So, predictive policing is a great example where you can reinforce historical patterns by, in fact, finding crime where you are looking, leading to over-policing in some areas and under-policing in others, and reinforcing that pattern. And so we need to think about the entire system, the humans that are making decisions with input from algorithms, and then the social, historical, legal, and political context that this is all embedded in. So a really simple example is on the next page about how we could think about this differently. So do we want our algorithms to make predictions, or do we want algorithms to intervene in cycles that are harmful? So if our goal is not to predict the failure of who will not show up to court, but to actually help defendants succeed, then we would take a really different approach, and we might not use algorithms at all. So for example, text message reminders about court dates reduce failure to appear by this 26 to 36% by this Stanford study. So the danger of the algorithm is the algorithm, you could have an algorithm to send text messages, I guess, right? But if you've got this thing that you've paid for, right, this algorithm that you've bought already and you think it can solve your problem, then you don't go to these other solutions, like just send text messages and more people will show up. Provide transportation and childcare or an evening court date to a mother who can't show up at the time that you're asking. So those sorts of interventions can be vastly more beneficial to both the individuals in the system and also to society as a whole than what an algorithm could do. So these not rocket science solutions can be as helpful as a predictive algorithm. And I think we tend to have a bias toward using the algorithm because it is there. All right. So the next couple of slides, and we wanted to end on sort of a bigger picture question. And this, I hope, will be discussion more than anything. I started by saying, what's an algorithm? Well, there's a simple answer to that question. What is justice? There's not such a simple answer to this question in the digital context or not.
Or even in the law, Melanie. It's not an answer in computer science or the law. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And actually, the more we talk about it, the more it looks like the law is essentially the algorithm we have sort of as a society developed.
This is why I love studying. This is why I love law school. Nobody tells anyone that it's just computer science. And go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so the law is essentially an algorithm. It's a messy algorithm with humans sort of.
It is. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so the next slide gets at a key problem that we know about sort of intuitively in the law, but now there's been some work by theoretical computer scientists that say, well, what happens? So before we kind of even understand what justice is, right, we know that there are conflicting notions of justice. And that's in fact what courts are designed to work out. But there are mathematical proofs that have been developed that essentially say that algorithms can't be perfectly fair. You can't be simultaneously fair to individuals and to whole populations if the distribution of individuals over the population is not exactly the same. So that you essentially have to give up fairness in one domain in order to provide fairness to another in terms of, what is your likelihood of being incorrectly convicted when you are innocent or incorrectly exonerated when you were guilty. And so, we now understand that the idea that an algorithm can come in and solve these problems with no bias, we actually have proofs that that is not possible. So I think then what we're left with is needing to understand a little more deeply about what the sort of conflicting notions of justice and fairness actually are. So the next slide has a cartoon. We could take a poll. I bet most of you have seen some variant of this. But I think it's really instructive to think about this in terms in this algorithmic context. So I have a couple of these cartoons, all of which maybe are slightly problematic. But the idea here is to think about equality, equity, and justice. And so in the first box, right, there are these kids, they're trying to look over the fence to see this game.
World Series.
That's nice, Sonia.
I say World Series.
Right, we have sports again, right? Okay, so these three kids, they're trying to look over this fence. They are all given equal size boxes, right? And they can't see over the fence. Only the tallest can see over the fence with equal size boxes. The notion of equity is to provide the supports that each needs in order to achieve the goal. So the shorter child gets more boxes. Okay, that's one version of equity. And what people have suggested is, why don't we, instead of providing people with boxes, just remove the fence, right? Remove the actual barrier that's causing the problem. And so that's an important way to look at this. Should our algorithms be meting out, sort of boxes as they are in the second image, or should the algorithms actually be trying to feed back into the system to remove the barriers in the first place? That's the idea of, hey, why don't you send text messages instead of keeping people in jail? Right, that algorithms could actually make those kinds of suggestions. All right, the next slide has another variant of this little cartoon, which I think is also instructive. This is a version, well, first of all, there are different races and genders in this image. And also there are people for whom a box is not a helpful intervention, right? So this individual is given a wheelchair ramp. That again requires understanding context, right? Different people in different circumstances are going to, in order, if the idea is to provide equal opportunity, there are different ways that different people can access that opportunity. There's another, we might maybe come back to these again. There's the next slide has another view on this question that I really, I think is important to think about. In this cartoon, the individuals are the same. The individuals are identical. They just happen to have been born on opposite sides of a tree and have access to apples from opposite sides of this tree. And this tree is bent over so that it happens that on one side of the tree, there are a lot of apples and they fall easily into this kid's hands. And in the other, that's not the case. And so the equality answer, as in the previous example, is, give each ladders. One ladder doesn't reach. The equity idea is give each a ladder, give a taller ladder on the side that is where the tree, you have to get to a higher level. But that the real justice, again, is to change the problem itself. So here it's fixing the inequity of the tree being bent over. So this is actually, right, so you prop up the tree rather than changing anything about the individual people in each side. There's a Medium post about this and a lot of discussion about it that points out that, part of this makes the valid point that there are structures that are inherently unfair. But there are also how did this come to be, right? Did it just so happen that one kid was born on one side of the tree and the other on the other? Or did somebody's ancestors bend that tree over so that they just had easier access, right? What are the sort of historical structural conditions that led to this inequality? And that's really what we want if we're trying to improve, if we're after justice, we're trying to improve that whole system. And how do we think about embedding algorithms in that sort of a world?
And Melanie, I was just going to say, we've been thinking about this. I'm teaching torts this semester. I love torts, and we're working on tort damage awards, right? What's the right way to make people whole to address errors in the history? And we want to solve these things through the law. We want to solve them through the court system. And there's not an answer to do this, right? There's not a way to use the law for this, and the more complex side that people don't want to use the law to solve things this way. There's still this idea that maybe our young gentleman in the blue on the right could just work harder at life. Why didn't he learn how to jump or scale the tree if he really needed that apple? And that's what I think makes it so very hard to have public policy conversations about this, is because people will look at the boy in the blue on the right and say, he must not want it enough. If he has been given a harder set of cards, dealt a harder set of cards, he should have learned how to address that. I'm sorry.
No apologies. No, that's a really important point. And I think this is also a computational sort of thinking about this is, let's assume an ideal world and then have our algorithms work in it. And the world is very far from ideal, and the ways in which that's true are parts of the reasons that algorithms are not going to solve our problems of injustice. So the last one version of these cartoons is one that I just came across over the weekend. I was looking for versions of these. And this came out actually this is Race, Metaphor, and Myth in Academic Medicine. So this is actually about the use of processes similar to algorithms that are used in the healthcare system, right? And this is a very different look at, this context of why some people have a hard time seeing over this fence is a different interpretation of what kinds of structural barriers there are to equality and justice. And again, I think looking at this picture, the idea that an algorithm is going to solve this problem, right, becomes even more sort of troubling and difficult to understand how this can be. But I think that's the challenge that we need to focus on. All right, I think that is the end. Is that the end of our slides?
A fancy slide, questions and discussions.
Yeah, so we will now open it up to all of you, and it looks like there's quite a few great questions.
And I'm going to stop sharing so I can look at all the pictures also. All right. Did we want to read through some of the questions in the chat, Melanie? What do you think? Julia, what's the best way to catch them all?
I think, well, I see.
Sorry. If anyone has a question, maybe raise your hand in the participant list. Otherwise, let's take a look at chat.
Excellent. Let's see. I think there's a quote here, right, that the people who build algorithms all have values, and those values can be racism, homophobia, et cetera, right? So part of, one of those problems is sort of the baked in sort of biases and flaws of the people making the algorithms, some of them implicit, some of them quite overt. So I think, let's see, is the next, I see that Rich had a question about how much the algorithmic push is tied to for-profit companies. So this is a really important question. We mentioned this Arnold tool, right, is a nonprofit. It's one of the few that's a nonprofit that got into this space in order to, try to be sort of a fair-ish arbiter of these things. However, as Sonia said, most of these things are the software that you can buy is made by for-profit companies. The black box, the algorithm, the actual code inside is proprietary, right? It's how they make their money. And so they are protected in many cases from having to reveal it. And I think a particular danger for automated algorithms that's sort of beyond the sort of dangers that we normally face in this space is that once you've made the algorithm and you've built a software system around it, then you have a tool that you can sell to lots of people for lots of purposes. And so it's the repurposing of an algorithm that you designed. Maybe it was for pretrial detention, but now you use it to determine who gets out for parole. And then you use it, you tweak a few knobs and say, okay, now we're going to predict who's going to repay their loan, right? And so there's a tremendous incentive for these for-profit companies to sell their software. And the hard part is the validation and the ensuring that you're getting what you're paying for. So even in the best ones, right, that's a really problematic. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to add the thing that really gets me about this for-profit, and we're watching this in the business world, of course, which is the rise of angel investors and this idea of get a product, get it to market as fast as possible, and let's run with it. But what we understand, right, is that if we're looking at recidivism rates, well, how many years are we waiting between action to action, right? How many, if someone's arrested in 2010, are we looking to see if they did not have a long recidivism until 2015? Or is it 2 years? Or how many years is sufficient? But this product will have already been in use. It will be revalidating built-in historical errors, and something that our colleagues, or the wonderful talk by the Santa Fe Institute this summer, on the understanding that we do know that law enforcement will go in and put false charges on people that they know the DA is going to drop or is not going to pursue. But the software, even the Arnold tool, had already discovered that people who just had lots of false charges attached to them that DAs never pursued ended up having higher Arnold tool scores and higher risk because of law enforcement's biased policing in communities. That's a real thing, right? That's even bigger than this not-for-profit and an idea of quality control. We're not even looking at quality control when it comes to algorithms because of this rush to market and all the money that can be made. This is a big, big industry. Sorry, that always gets me worked up.
There's a question Steve asked about whether we should abandon algorithms in cases where discrimination is prevalent. So this, I think, this is really tough.
It's everywhere.
It's one that's everywhere. So that might mean a total abandonment of algorithms. But what has been interesting in the discussions with local political leaders is that many people pushing for the use of algorithms in criminal justice in New Mexico are actually on the left, right? These are people who see algorithms as one of the very few ways to get people out of jail on parole. Mm-hmm. Or to get people released from pretrial detention, because the way that the system works right now, it is so hard to give people a fair shot, right? The deck is stacked against, the person who really needs to be freed because, for all the reasons that we understand the way someone might be in prison and shouldn't be. So it's tough because you're measuring this problematic approach against something that is perhaps even more problematic, which is the status quo. And so I don't know the answer to that question. I think maybe it's sort of case by case. How do you make the algorithms both better than what we have now, and in thinking about this feedback loop, sort of self-improving? Like, how do you build the system from the start so that it's going to be imperfect? Can you make it better and better over time? And I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. I'm generally pretty pessimistic that we're going to have the political will to do that right. But I do think that it at least is a game changer. And maybe this is an opportunity to really fundamentally change an unfair system in a way that's positive.
I was going to say, I talked with a young coder this summer. He's had an internship at Google, and sharing with him my research. And basically, he just was just shy of, you old lady, you know, you just don't want technology to be free. You don't want technology to be great. You're holding it back by seeing all these barriers. And I've become, like I said, a tinfoil hat person, right? And this notion of we'll correct the software when we see the outcomes doesn't line up with the reality of how human time actually occurs. You know, this split decision that the algorithm makes and then makes again, and then provides its own long-term determination is like some awesome episode of Black Mirror. I'm already giving them an idea for their next great episode, right? That we can't even predict what's coming. It doesn't matter that, yes, that we will be able to correct it down the line, because when it impacts a person's access to housing, many people may not have studied, but this past summer, because of hacking, because of ransomware, because of nefarious actors, people have been denied their housing allocations. So it may feel like a very small thing. You make a phone call, but who are you going to call to say, why did the algorithm, or why did you not allow me to get access? Why was I marked as a person for fraud? And this is happening all across the country in every single dimension. And I want to be careful, Melanie, with the time, because I see we've got one kind of interesting question about our interdisciplinariness. Did you want to take that?
Oh, I missed our interdisciplinarianism question. Which one is that?
Further down. So are we planning on involving librarians and sociologists in our group going forward?
Yes, so our group, we are self-created, and I think we grow as people come and talk to us. So if you are such a person, yes, a couple of the SFI folks are social scientists. We are an informal group, and we are really happy to talk to other folks. So come talk with us. Absolutely.
We don't even have dues or anything yet. That'll be next year's edition. Melanie, we've got one more question I think is really important about how do these algorithms shake out into COVID and data? And I know you and Kathy did an excellent article about this.
Yeah, so thanks, Heather. Excellent question. I think, let me give an example from the flu, actually, so where we know that this played out. So there's a huge sort of infrastructure that predicts how much flu has actually occurred, because lots of people get the flu and they don't go to the doctor, and right. So there's algorithms that essentially are predicting what flu prevalence is, and that's determining policy. There was very clear evidence that the algorithm was failing in Texas. And the reason that it was failing is there was a flu outbreak in the Hispanic population in Texas, and these were people who did not go to the doctor, right? They did not have healthcare. And so they didn't show up anywhere in the data. And so that made it, the predictions were completely wrong, because they were ignoring the people who were both most likely to be sick, but also most likely not to show up in the system until there were, small numbers of very sick people in the hospital. Yes, I think COVID, the same sorts of things are going on, where we know raw number counts aren't sufficient. So we have algorithms to try to make up for false negatives and untested people. And those algorithms also have these kinds of assumptions that don't make the right predictions on the res, and, in communities without access to healthcare, and enormously problematic. We could go on, but we probably shouldn't.
Yeah. As you guys can see, we love this stuff. We love this stuff. And I was just kind of reading through the comments. I just love that so many from health sciences are paying attention to this. From so many different disciplines are thinking about this complex topic. So thank you. We fully appreciate your time and giving us a chance to chat about something we've come to really enjoy.
Well, and our thanks to you for doing this under these conditions. We really appreciate you taking the time and putting the time into making a really great, accessible talk about an important topic. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. And hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.